So, as we all know, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is just in desperate need of a victory. The once undisputed champion of Hollywood has been mired in a prolonged stretch of critical and commercial failures and even some off-screen controversies. But the latest film, Thunderbolts, has been getting a lot of positive buzz. Is it too much to hope that this is the film to finally get the MCU back on track? Or are we destined to be disappointed yet again? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So, in an almost meta way, Thunderbolts probes the question of what a post-Avengers world looks like, and whether a new batch of heroes has what it takes to carry the story into the future. And on the surface, a film centered around lesser-known sidekicks and third-string heroes seems like an unlikely vehicle to get the series back on track. But against all odds, it succeeds. So if you guys have been around the channel for a while, you know that I've been as down and checked out on the MCU recently, really as much as anyone. But I really enjoyed this movie. I think almost like an aging athlete, past his prime, that digs deep for one more match. I think this film does prove that Marvel still has the goods and the ability just to tell a very entertaining comic book story. Because Thunderbolts, I think, is easily the best MCU film in years. I think offering compelling characters and a meaningful story. And I think perhaps most importantly, just a sense of direction and purpose that this franchise is just so desperately needed. Now, in one sense, I think Thunderbolts does feel a little bit like a remix of all the familiar MCU elements. It has the goofy sort of Guardians of the Galaxy-esque ensemble of bantering anti-heroes wrapped in the grittier and more grounded aesthetic and tone of something like a Captain America Winter Soldier. But rather than feeling derivative, I think sort of that tonal combination just effectively guards against some of the excesses that have derailed the franchise. It avoids the overly silly and wacky tones of something like Thor, Love and Thunder, but also the very self-important seriousness of something more recently like Captain America Brave New World. I think this is actually one of the funniest MCU films in years, with some really just hilarious deadpan deliveries and comedic timing, particularly from actress Florence Pugh. At the same time, it never feels forced or just desperate to please. And to me, I think it's a film that finally appears to have learned the right lessons from the MCU sort of recent failures and returns to the roots of what made this franchise the biggest thing going in cinema for really over a decade. And much of this film's success, I think, is due to its very superb cast. I think kind of interestingly, sort of the underrated Black Widow film is often lost in the shuffle of the more flashy and cosmic MCU stories, but it may ultimately prove to be really among its most consequential. Because that film's introduction of actress Florence Pugh in the role of Elena was one of the few heroes that, to me, showed real promise and star power to be able to carry the Avengers torch into the future. And I think she proves here to be more than capable of the task, because she is awesome. I think kind of her combination of just butt-kicking strength and more emotionally earned vulnerability just make the character a very easy one to root for. And fellow Black Widow alumni David Harbour in the role of Red Guardian is also fantastic in his return, and he just infuses the story with a ton of humor and infectious enthusiasm, and I think establishes himself sort of as the potential Drax character of the new MCU. And one thing I do like about this film is that yes, the characters are so-called anti-heroes, but the movie's focus is always on how they're striving towards goodness, rather than merely reveling in the worst parts of their nature. That's something like Deadpool. They may not be traditional good guys, but they are relatable good guys, which I think makes them even more compelling. Director Jake Schreier is a newcomer to the MCU, and I think he delivers some of the most impressive filmmaking the series has seen, at least in some time, because the film thankfully lacks some of the glossy visuals and weightless action that has become prevalent. You've still got sort of the spectacle and devastation, but it all has a more tactile feel to it. I think the action is also well choreographed and exciting as well, such as one long take kind of top-down action sequence of Elena advancing down a long hallway, dispatching bad guy goons that feels like something out of a John Wick movie. And I think perhaps a byproduct of director Schreier coming from a background of filming music videos is that Thunderbolts is also elevated by some very striking visual storytelling. And the MCU antagonists, for all the hate that they often get, have often been like interesting mirrors of the heroes, and like Thunderbolts takes that premise, I think, further than ever before, with the heroes that like battle against almost literal like personifications of their own like internal darkness and despair. And to that end, the film effectively like utilizes light and darkness throughout, and motifs such as mirrors to create some like surprisingly like impactful visual moments. And like at the end of the day, Thunderbolts may still be, just an entertaining kind of pulpy comic book movie, but it just has a level of like thoughtfulness and I think like intentionality that I think elevates it like above the fray of the genre. As far as to consider things going on the surface of this, for language, there is a frequent amount of like profanities, mostly starting with the letter S, and like most problematic to me is there's also just like a gratuitous number of like religious exclamations, such as like GD or using the name of Jesus or JC. As far as violence, mostly standard MCU style bloodless violence. Kind of like the most extreme moments involve two characters who like, get shot with a bullet in the face, although the first you don't actually see it happen, and the second character is masked, although like, you do see some blood like emerge from the wound. There's also some violence that's like directed towards children, making it even more unsettling, including like a repeated flashback where a child is shot and killed, although the murder always happens off screen. And then another scene where some kids are like abused in a kind of a school with a whip, although again the action happens off screen. And as far as sexuality, nothing going on in this film. As far as themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface, I think this movie is largely centered around like the theme of just power, kind of like what it is and like what does it take to obtain and wield it. Because the film explores the question of like whether it is the heroic kind of internal character or merely the superhuman powers that are best positioned to keep the world safe. And the plot involves like the Sentry Project, which is a secretive kind of government initiative to essentially create superheroes in a lab. But as one character muses, kind of giving such powers to noble men like Steve Rogers, aka Captain America, is one thing, but like, what happens when these superpowered abilities are given to less like virtuous people? And like, isn't there more to being a hero than merely power? But CIA leader Valentina de Fontaine doesn't think so, or at least doesn't care, as long as she's the one in control of that power. And she makes a really fascinating statement where she says, righteousness without power is just an opinion. And in her view, kind of like good intentions and like virtue are admirable, but if you want real change, you need to wield power, even if it comes like at the expense of righteousness and like internal character. And I think much of this film is sort of an exploration of that mindset. For example, Bucky kind of wavers all throughout, kind of between his like dueling personas, is like Congressman Bucky and then like the Winter Soldier, because he wants to like enact change, but despite sort of his wishes, it just seems like power and strength are the only path to do so. And I think for like the rest of this sort of the Thunderbolt team, they all have the strength and like, abilities to like various degrees, but the question is more like whether they have the internal goodness to be heroes. And while sort of like the answer to that question in the film isn't always simplistic or like cut and dry, I do think kind of the underlying message is that character matters. I will also note that I do think there's also kind of an unmistakable, like at least hint of like political commentary in this, because the government official in charge of the project is willing to abandon ethical considerations to just wield powers that she deems necessary to accomplish good ends. And like her declaration, I'm unimpeachable, is obviously a very like on the nose illusion. But the theme itself, I think, also has a much like wider application, just as a challenge to the sort of like might makes right philosophy that seems to have become popular in like today's culture, both like inside and outside the Christian community. And it's interesting to me watching this film as a Christian that like the newly created superhero eventually comes to see himself as a sort of God, and he is initially like kind of challenged by others that he's throwing around the title of God too flippantly, but remarks that he is all-powerful, even more so than people like Thor, who are considered to be like a literal god in like the MCU universe. And kind of, after all, like, isn't that what it means to be a god? And he ultimately concludes, why would a god take orders from anyone? And although the film doesn't necessarily itself take like a religious approach to that, I do think that it establishes the idea that like no amount of sort of seemingly unlimited power can equip fallen man to play God, and kind of any misguided attempts to do so will inevitably lead to destruction. Yes, God is all-powerful, but he is also all-loving and all-good, and kind of power without righteousness is just a devastating and evil force. And like ultimately in the film, it is sort of the righteous character more than just the raw power that is demonstrated to be like the mark of a true hero. So, in the end, I think Thunderbolts is the first MCU film, I think in years, that actually inspires me with some like legitimate optimism for like the future of the franchise. It's the first film in some time that I think feels like it's actually about something more than merely sort of fulfilling some corporate mandate to be the next cog in like the MCU machine, where it's not just like a good MCU movie measured against like an increasingly low bar, but I think it's just a good movie period. I think kind of by distancing itself from the convoluted and I think mostly uninteresting like multiverse framework and just returning the series back to its roots of heroes with more like personal human stakes, I think Thunderbolts introduces a very like, intriguing path forward for the MCU and suggests that perhaps we shouldn't count out the franchise just yet. But hey, I would love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this one as much as I did, or hey, maybe you were let down once again, don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't done so too, encourage you guys, become a Collider, subscribe to the channel, got lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through all for Christ.